The Constitution notes, please add 3 pieces of information that you learn from this lecture on your slide, or questions or definitions of words. On page 497 in your regular government book, or page A13 to A34 in your AP government book, what you'll find is the Constitution of the United States. It's actually not very long. So when we look at it, it's really a 3-part structure. First is the preamble. This outlines the purposes of government. I want you to go ahead, pause this video, and open up to page 497 or A13 to A34. Now let's read this together. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. This outlines the goals of the Constitution, the goals of the government of the United States: to ensure justice, peace, defense, good general welfare of us all, and freedom. And this is a pretty profound statement in the history of political philosophy. The articles is the next part. Think of this as chapters. In each article, the Constitution outlines a different part of the government, giving it its powers and defining all of the principles that we'll learn about. Article 1 is the legislative branch. This is no coincidence that it's the first. It's the biggest and the most important of the branches of government. The executive branch is the next, the judicial branch, federalism outside, outline constitutional amendment process, supremacy of national law, and ratification process. This is a how-to book. This is a how-to paper on the Constitution. The last part is the 27 amendments. First 10 are called the Bill of Rights. They're ratified in the Constitution after 1791. In fact, there's only been 17 amendments since 1791. And 2 of those were, one of those were to negate the other. So really, there's just been 15 since 1791 that are still in effect today. Of course, prohibition was the 18th Amendment, and the 21st Amendment was, negated that. The amendment process is outlined in the Constitution as well. You can see here on the bottom right hand of your screen the actual process, and I've written them up here in the notes. The one that's happened every time is A, proposed by 2/3 of each chamber of Congress. This is actually pretty difficult to do. So there's been a lot of them proposed throughout history, but there's been very few that have actually met the requirements of 2/3 of each chamber of Congress. The other possibility that's never happened is proposed by National Constitutional Convention, by 2/3 of the state legislature. Either way, once it's proposed and passes through Congress, it needs to be ratified or approved by either 3/4 of the state legislatures or 3/4 of special state conventions. Now, the special state convention is where that 21st Amendment occurred. However, outside of that, that's never been successfully done. So there's a few principles that guided the founders when they were writing this Constitution. The very first is called limited government. Basically, governments must follow the rule of law. That means that they can be prosecuted for crimes. The people who run the government can be prosecuted for crimes as well. In monarchies, this didn't happen very often. In fact, they were sort of above the king or queen or royalty, were above the law. Government would always be limited to the will of people if the government itself is following the rule of law. So this is basically a broad principle that the other principles are following or trying to achieve. Popular sovereignty is the second principle. This comes from a political philosopher, British guy named John Locke. He came up with the idea of a social contract. Basically, that government isn't really the government telling people what to do, but an actual contract between the people. They give up certain freedoms in order to create peace in their chaotic world. People are the most important source of government power. This is found throughout the entire Constitution. This is not to be mistaken with equality between people. This was not the case at the founding. Women couldn't vote. There's no protections of political equality in the Constitution itself. Each state was basically, each state had their own rules about who could vote and who could not. This is also not to be mistaken with sovereignty of state. Sovereignty of state is when the governments don't have to ask any other governments what to do. Popular sovereignty is when each person or the people as an aggregate have sovereignty or freedom over the government and can overthrow it if they choose. In the United States, revolutions or overthrowing of the government happens anytime that there's an election, but it happens in a peaceful manner, which has been very successful in the United States. Go ahead and pause. The third is the separation of powers. This would limit government because basically each government would be able, or each branch of government would be able to do separate things. They would be split between the three branches. On the bottom right, you can see this is that Congress makes laws, executive branch enforces them, and the Supreme Court or the judicial branch interprets the laws. This has been a separation of powers, and if you notice, each of those three are granted power in separate ways. The legislative branch, as written, the House of Representatives is elected by the people, and as written, the state laws, state legislature are allowed to, or are the ones who elect the senators. However, that's changed. Today we elect both the representatives and the senators. Article 2, the president is elected by the Electoral College, not directly by the people. And the third branch, the Supreme Court or the judicial branch, those justices are nominated by the executive branch, by the president, and confirmed by the Senate. Go ahead and pause. Checks and balances. This was another tool. Basically allowed each branch not only to have separate powers, that's a positive power, but now to have negative powers. It means that they could control or sort of outdo or outmaneuver a different part of the government. This made sure that each branch was always sort of competing between each other, always sort of trying to make sure that they had power, and then that they would always be fighting. This would create this would ensure that there would never be one branch that could take complete government control. Again, this is limited government. Go ahead and pause. The last one is federalism. This is the most complicated part. However, what it does is this would ensure that government powers are split between national and state governments. This allowed there to be buffers of sorts between national and local power. It's not a very clean distinction. You can see on the right, on the bottom right hand, that there are some national powers and some state powers that each of them have independently of the other. And then there's some shared powers. Now the Supreme Court, thank goodness, has been around. Its main job is to define what is a national and what is a state power. Certainly the Supreme Court has been declaring laws of the national legislature unconstitutional or state legislatures unconstitutional. But certainly the most important part is when they define whether a national government can do certain things to the states or whether the states must listen to the national government. Go ahead and pause. Federalism is split between, sort of like we saw in that Venn diagram, between three different types of powers. Delegated powers also could be enumerated, E-N-U-M-rated government powers. Also, this could be called exclusive powers. Those terms are interchangeable: delegated, enumerated, and exclusive. These are things that only the federal government can do. They could sign treaties. They can coin money. They can declare war. States cannot do any of those things. There's now a national currency. And the federal government can declare war and actually maintain army as well. Reserve powers are things that only the state can do. Educational standards, city and county governments, conducting elections. Okay, conducting elections is a reserve power. This is something we don't think about a lot. When you elect a president or vote for in a presidential election or in a national legislature election, even though the president is a national office, you are actually only voting for the state, through the state. And whoever wins in that state then gets the electors from the Electoral College. There'll be more on that later. Concurrent powers are the ones that they can both do. These are usually not as controversial because, frankly, since they both can do them, there's not any sort of fight between them. They both can collect taxes. Your paychecks are going to be deducted federally and state through federal and state taxes. Maintain court systems. You can be charged with crimes in the federal or the state courts. Also, both the states and the federal government can go into debt by borrowing money and issuing bonds. Okay, go ahead and pause. National and regional governments work together in a federalism. Regional governments are called states in the U.S., provinces in Canada, and other federalist governments throughout the world. At least two levels must be present to be a federal system. There are some advantages to this. It seems pretty murky, but it does help social and political conflict. This is that loose coupling system where if somebody in the South wants certain traffic laws or education, they can do that without there being some sort of massive retaliation or revolution. Think about if the federal government was in charge of collecting the garbage of 310 million people. It would be an absolute mess. Certainly, delegating that authority to the state and to local governments has helped create an efficient government, an efficient amount of public services for the citizens. Innovation is also encouraged this way because people or local governments have the freedom to try new things. They don't have to follow the federal law in every single little thing. Also maximizes political participation. There's a lot more opportunities to either vote or actually participate in an election process. For example, people can run for local city councils or local parks boards or anything like that because there's those opportunities. More opportunities for government checks over each other equals more protection of individual freedoms. Go ahead and pause. There are also some disadvantages. Also, it may fan the flame of regional differences. Certainly, when you get massive difference throughout the country, those you can feel like you're living in a different world than the other places, the other states. Really hard to coordinate efforts by all local governments throughout the country. If you want suddenly for all of the garbage or some sort of conservation efforts to occur in every single city, well, it's going to take a long time for each city to adopt that particular practice. All 50 states have different banking and insurance laws, so sometimes it can be more expensive for businesses trying to do business in multiple states. Also, it could be problematic if, let's say, you go from a different state where you don't have to have two license plates, one in the front and one in the back, and then you come into Iowa. Well, you can get in trouble in Iowa for not having that, even though you may not know it, because Iowa is one of the few states that require two license plates. And there's certainly not any signs or anything like that as you enter Iowa that reminds you of that. Innovation is encouraged, but slow moving because of B. There are so many localities that need to have those changes occur. If you look at women's suffrage, you can tell that, Wyoming was the first state to allow women the right to vote in the mid-1800s, and it took until 1920 before there was a national amendment, or before all of the states allowed those to happen. Same thing with child labor. Early 1800s is when Massachusetts outlawed child labor, but it wasn't until 1938 when the rest of the country followed suit, even though there were states here and there that did the same thing. National interest inhibited by local interests. So, for example, if Guantanamo Bay was to be shut down and all of the terrorists would be moved somewhere other than Guantanamo Bay, well, where are they going to go? Nobody's going to raise their hand. No city's going to raise their hand and say, yeah, sure, right by us. Or nuclear waste. Same thing. Go ahead and pause. So, the history of federalism is long and complicated. Today, it's fueled by federal purse strings or money. Federal mandates. States need to do blank, but the federal government doesn't pay for it. Okay, so there's different kinds of federal grants. Categorical grants. This is money for particular reasons. Black grants. This is general purpose grants, basically for this category, and then the states can spend it how they would like. Go ahead and pause. All right, so what I would like you to do is go ahead and pause this, look on the Constitution. You can see it's pages starts on A13 for the AP government book and 497 for the regular government book. Please look through the Constitution, skim through it. It's a relatively short document.